Köszönöm szépen, hölgyeim és uraim, nagyon köszönöm a meghívást a konferenciára. Nehéz nyelv magyar van, de érdekes. Szanowni Państwo.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to use the opportunity that we have Polish interpretation. I'm going to speak in Polish. Excuse me, my Hungarian is not so good as you could hear. In spite of what we heard before, I'm not going to talk about the court decision. I actually devoted this presentation to a completely different topic. It is something positive. I was looking for something positive in the activities of the European Union institutions, although the end result is not so positive as I was hoping for. So in Poland, something strange is happening because the European Commission has created a situation in which the Polish courts are basically forced to provoke the Polish authorities. So one court questions the status of the other courts. Actually, the whole thing started in 2018 when the reform of the judicial system started in Poland, and we wanted to get rid of all the communist burdens that we have been carrying with us. In 1989, or after 1989, we actually did not change the judicial system in merit, and actually we implemented many reforms all over the social life, but the judicial system, the court system, fundamentally remained the same. It remained very communistic. So we started a reform in 2018 to which the European Commission responded very aggressively, and we must take it into account that this aggressive reaction was because we came up with some new solutions that actually we tried to take over directly from the German and the Spanish systems. So it was really interesting how come it was okay for Germany and for Spain, but they somehow didn't like it to be transposed to the Polish system. So according to the European Union, it's okay for Spain and to Germany to appoint the judges the way they do, but Poland is not suitable to do the same thing. So this battle is still ongoing. I am participating in this battle myself, and I don't want to talk about it in detail. I actually cannot go into details. Once this the fight is over, I will be able to tell you everything from my side. So currently, I work as a judge, so I am not allowed to talk about this. However, I am convinced that we are going to win this fight. Even if we lose it, I am absolutely convinced that the Hungarians and the Polish know already that even if we lose with honor. But I am convinced that we are going to win at this one. So, what I would like to talk about today is another issue which relates to an activity of the Union where we can say that it concerns all the EU citizens who travel abroad to third countries. The Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union states that European citizens has the right to enjoy in the territory of a third country in which the member state of which they are nationals is not represented, the protection of the diplomatic and consular authorities of any member state on the same conditions as the nationals of that state. This seems to be a very good solution if the member state doesn't have representation in the third country. However, in practice, this is such a regulation that is unimplementable. In third countries, it is very, very rare that such things could happen because the Union actually built up a huge system of support and providing aid to each other. And there are lots of regulations concerning these mechanisms in the various EU treaties. But in practice, in reality, nobody is really making sure that these are implemented properly. When we created these mechanisms of consular protection, the EU did not set up its own mechanisms, but actually talked about the consulates of the different member states. So the Union as such does not have foreign representations, consulates and embassies, but they count on the consulates and embassies of the member states. From this, it follows that if an EU citizen doesn't have a representation of its own member state in a third country, well, actually, let's just talk about Poland, Poland's case. We have over 40 bilateral agreements which govern the foreign representations of Polish citizens in third countries. But the EU ignored it. Why? It's because Germany doesn't have such bilateral agreements. Also, Hungary has similar agreements. If I know correctly, Hungary has about a dozen of such bilateral agreements. So the mechanism itself that the EU created only concerns a very narrow circle. For example, it relates to accidents, cases of death, arrests, road traffic accidents where medical emergency is needed or quick evacuation is needed, for instance, in the case of a natural disaster like a volcano eruption or earthquake, or if somebody's documents are stolen and a transitional passport needs to be issued. So these are the issues that the EU directive regulates. And in any other sort of diplomatic representation is not covered. What is the most harmful for Central European countries is that the protection of the citizen of the given country depends on the regulations of the home country, or the member state itself, of which he is citizen. So, for example, if a Polish citizen ends up with the protection of a Finnish consulate in a third country, then the Finnish consulate must treat the Polish citizen exactly the same way as it would a Finnish citizen. So the Finnish consulate cannot differentiate between the Finnish or the Polish citizen. In the case of the Central European member states, this role of protection, of consular protection, is governed by the constitution. Well, at least in Poland and as far as I know in Hungary too, it is in the constitution of these two countries to provide this kind of protection. So these tasks are provided for free. The citizens do not have to pay for it. So the Polish consulate would help a Lithuanian, Spanish or a Swedish citizen free of charge. But at the same time, in many Western countries, they fulfill the same tasks. However, they charge the citizen for whom they provide protection. So if a Polish citizen or a Hungarian citizen ends up in a third country where he needs the protection of another member state's consulate, then he will have to pay the price. And the EU unfortunately did not create an efficient mechanism due to this exact fact. The EU seems to have forgotten about such factors. It can be sort of an arrogance. So the EU forgot that based on international law, it should be asked in every single case what the third country thinks about, or how the third country regulates these things. So the EU issued a directive, but they think that everybody, even countries in Africa, will abide by these regulations. But actually, in practice, that's not how it works. Because let's suppose that a Polish citizen might end up in trouble in an African country, and he goes to the consulate of an EU member state, and the consulate tries to provide some kind of aid to him. But in the given African country, maybe the local government of that country will not allow it because they do not have information about it, that this other EU member state is responsible for providing support to this certain citizen. So the EU worked out this mechanism, but it ignored the fact that this is not a general global regulation that would apply in all corners of the world. Besides this, they also ignored the international bilateral agreements. Like I said, in the case of Poland, there are over 40 such bilateral agreements, and it is regulated there how, in what ways the consul can meet an EU citizen who has been arrested, for example. There are many ways to do that. So in some countries, written consent is necessary from the country's government where it happens, and in some countries, the third country's consul or authorities, the third country's authorities must be notified. And sometimes the consul doesn't even know how to notify the other country's authorities. So many times he just doesn't do anything. And therefore, the European regulations just not put in practice. Another thing that we have to pay attention to is that the Union based this ideology on Article 23 of the Treaty of Europe, and it stipulates how it provides aid in third countries based on the stipulations of the of Article 23. So let's say that an EU citizen needs the representation of another EU member state's consulate in a third country. It is actually printed in the EU passports, but it's just a huge promotion which doesn't really have a practical background, because in reality it is very often limited to issuing a temporary passport until the person can return to his home country, for example, when his passport has been stolen. But there are many cases when, for example, somebody needs to be transported from home. For example, in the case of war or in the case of a pandemic, some countries may decide that they evacuate their citizens. So how does it happen in reality? The implementation of such actions are usually very chaotic. We have to highlight that actually when this takes place, the EU mechanisms are not used. It is always based, when it has happened in the case of Poland, for example, the Ukrainian consulate was used by Poland, so most Polish citizens were evacuated using Ukrainian help and Ukrainian planes, because that seemed the most logical solution and the most cost-efficient solution, because flying the Polish citizens to Ukraine meant that they were almost at home already, because Ukraine is quite close to Poland. And the same thing happened in Australia, in Canada, in the United States. Actually, nobody cared if the person was an EU member state citizen or not. So In summary, all these mechanisms are only a facade which do not really work in reality. So what can we do about them? What's the solution? The operation of consulates is very important for economic cooperation as well. And also our region must develop these cooperations, and regional cooperation treatment or regional cooperation agreements, must be signed. The Scandinavian countries are way ahead of us. They are doing much better, but the Visegrad 4 countries could follow their example. It doesn't mean that there should be only one consulate representing 4 countries everywhere, but there should be an office dealing with the citizens of all 4 countries. It would be very efficient also from the financial aspect, and it would also be quite a prudent solution. Actually, more and more countries decide to make cooperation agreements with each other like that, and that's the way of the future, it seems. So, in the case of Poland and Hungary, there could be such an agreement for general representation. Actually, in 1991, it was Poland that represented Hungary in South Korea. Similarly, in Belarus, and Poland has a similar agreement with Lithuania too. So, for example, in the Maghreb countries, meaning Algeria, Libya, and Morocco, and Tunisia, in these countries, the Polish consulate represents Lithuanian citizens. So, let me tell you how it works in practice. The European Commission has actually commissioned me to review the issue of consular protection, and based on the statistics, the situation seemed really terrible. But there are only some classical cases. So I concluded that perhaps Poland has 5 cases all in all where it had to represent citizens of another EU member state. However, there have been about a dozen cases when we helped Lithuanian citizens, but it wasn't based on the EU regulations. It was based on the bilateral agreement between Lithuania and Poland. So in the European Commission, then they asked me, so can we write that, can we include that in our statistics? And I said no. It is typical, by the way, of how they falsify statistics. So Poland has a huge consular system, especially, for instance, in regions like Central Asia, like Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and so on, some of the smaller republics of the ex-Soviet Union. And we could have stronger cooperations, for instance, with Hungary, because culturally we are very similar nations. We have long common history going back to the Middle Ages. We spilled our blood against fighting fighting against Islam, and we have very close relationships, like Polish and Hungarian are brothers, and so we should cooperate better on the consular field as well. Thank you.